Thank you for coming. First of all, on behalf of the Westchester Workforce Housing Coalition, I'd like to welcome you all to the first teach-in on affordable housing in Westchester County's history, at least to our knowledge. All right. I'm Alexander Roberts of the Community Housing Innovations. I'm one of your hosts, along with Jim Kaloran of Habitat for Humanity. All right, and Troy DeCohen, who is going to be here, we hope, momentarily. He's with Interfaith Clergy for Social Action. We have a tremendous lineup of speakers tonight who will explain the situation as it is today, what it should be, and what we all can do to make zoning and development more fair and equitable. Our heartfelt thanks go to M&T Bank and Paula Saraiva. You can stand up, Paula. She's a sponsor of tonight's teach-in. We have dedicated tonight to George Raymond, who for 20 years chaired the Westchester County Housing Opportunity Commission. He promoted the county's housing allocation plan for affordable housing. George passed away in December, but we will always remember him. He was a great man. What's a teach-in? Well, according to Merriam-Webster, it is an extended meeting usually held on a college campus for lectures, debates, and discussions to raise awareness or express a position on a social or political issue. And so, what this means is you are not an audience, okay? You are all activists, and all are invited to participate, and that's why we have the microphone right over there. We hope that today will become a starting point for collective action, finally to break the resistance to affordable and workforce housing among most of the county towns and villages in Westchester County, and that has also stunted our economic growth. Before we begin with the speakers, it is my pleasure to introduce Reverend Bart Worden, clergy leader of the Ethical Cultural Society of Westchester. Bart has worked as a social worker for 30 years and tirelessly for civil rights. Take it away, Reverend Worden.
So coming as I do from the tradition of ethical humanism, I would like to share with you an invocation that was presented to the New York Society for Ethical Culture a good number of years ago by Algernon Black, who was a champion of social justice in many different areas, including housing and criminal justice, race relations, and other things. And this is his invocation. This is a call to the living, to those who refuse to make peace with evil, with the suffering and the waste of the world. This is a call to the human, not the perfect, to those who know their own prejudices, who have no intention of becoming prisoners of their own limitations. This is a call to those who remember the dream of their youth, who know what it means to share food and shelter, the care of children and those who are troubled, to reach beyond the barriers of the past, bringing people to communion. This is a call to the never-ending spirit of the common person, whose essential decency and integrity, whose unending capacity to suffer and endure, to face death and destruction and to rise again and build from the ruins of life. This is the greatest call of all, the call to a faith in people.
Thank you. So let's start with a quick look at the problem. Simply put, the rent is too damn high. Stagnant wages and rising housing costs, abetted by restrictive zoning, has pushed the rate of cost-burdened renters, as defined by HUD, to an all-time high of 53% in Westchester County. That's the percentage of renters paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Local government land use regulation has sabotaged the free market for housing by restricting supply. The rate of severely cost-burdened renters in Westchester, those defined by HUD as paying more than 50% of their income for housing, many going without food or other necessities, has reached nearly 30%, or more than 1 in 4. But it's actually worse than that. Basically, as you can see, that's 30% for Westchester. But if you look at location affordability, which basically HUD and the U.S. Department of Transportation jointly run, where you can see the combined cost of transportation and housing for any place in the country. So in New York City, where you don't need a car, the transportation burden is lower. For the average single worker in the New York metropolitan region making about $33,000 a year, housing plus transportation would take nearly 80% of his or her income in Westchester County. Just think about that. So someone making $33,000, which is a worker's salary for our region, would have to spend 79% of their income on housing and transportation. And while the cost burdens are heavy in nearly every community, from Rye to Yonkers, the extreme disparity in rents between rich and poor communities means that low-income residents end up concentrated, or another word for that is segregated, in areas of low opportunity. And what does that mean? What does it mean? What does it mean, for example, for children? Let's take a look at that. The gray area here in this map shows Westchester districts with the best schools. These are shaded areas in districts where the great schools rating is 8 or above. It goes as high as 10. So if you look at Westchester, it has a well-deserved reputation for having the best schools, in the metropolitan area. But I want to show you what it looks like. This is the same map of school districts with great schools of 8 to 10. But adding the other parameter of districts or census tracts that have at least 10%, only 10% affordable housing. Now take a look at that. And basically, what that means is it's really tough for people making up to $85,000 a year, because that's what low income in Westchester is defined, a family of 4 making $85,000. But take a look at how basically the poor or those low income are confined to the inferior school districts. Let's also take a look at how the low income people, truly poor, are doing. Here is a map of the percent of students that are eligible for free or reduced price lunches in the districts around Yonkers and Mount Vernon. Look at those percentages. These students live in families with household income up to 185% of the poverty level, which for a family of 4 represents about $45,000 a year. As you can see, the better performing school districts have economically cleansed people of low income, denying them the opportunity that we say is the birthright of every citizen. It is no surprise that exclusionary zoning policies have had a disparate impact on minorities, putting them into the worst performing districts and some of the areas with low amenities and high crime. And the social mobility data show that for most people, your zip code determines your destiny later in life. Until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, segregation occurred not by coincidence, but by design, as redlining and deed restrictions eliminated African Americans from most developments. Thanks to exclusionary zoning, the systematic elimination of multifamily and affordable housing through land use policies, segregated patterns of development have continued, with one important difference. While racial discrimination was a sharp tool, exclusionary zoning is a blunt instrument that affects all families, regardless of race or ethnicity. This is a map of census tracts, the shaded areas, that have lost more than 20% of their 25 to 34-year-old populations since the 2000 census. Exclusionary zoning has devastated the economy of Westchester, as this cohort has literally run away. Scarsdale lost nearly 50% of its 25 to 34-year-olds since 2000. Newcastle, 32%. North Castle lost 25%. And Rye's population of 25 to 34-year-olds declined by 52%. Since millennials this year will pass the baby boomer generation in terms of numbers of workers, lack of affordable housing for young workers has put Westchester at a severe competitive disadvantage for business relocation. We feel it creates, however, an opportunity for a coalition of low and moderate income people and businesses trying to find employees. The cities like White Plains, New Rochelle, have seized the opportunity as they rush to put up rental housing to accommodate the demand, a positive trend. But because the supply has been restricted for so long, they have skewed development towards market rate or luxury housing, which is more profitable. This teach-in will hopefully allow us to assess the situation and suggest ways to move towards greater justice and economic opportunity for all citizens in Westchester County and its housing policy. We begin our speakers with the man who changed history in Westchester in 2009 and perhaps the nation with a very novel strategy. Craig Urian is the executive director of the Anti-Discrimination Center of New York, but you know him better as the lead plaintiff in the landmark case that produced the federal consent decree between HUD and Westchester. He sued the county over decades of false claims that it was meeting its obligations under the Fair Housing Act while taking federal money. Craig is our first speaker, and it's the first time he has told his story before a wide audience in Westchester. You will have the opportunity to ask questions after his presentation. Craig?
Well, our technical problems have been solved. Thank you, Alec, and thanks everybody for turning out tonight. I appreciate it. Well, and I guess we're just about standing room only, but there are a few seats in the front still, so if you want them, take them. So we're more than 6 years after the entry of the consent decree, and I really shouldn't be surprised by anything relating to it. But I just can't help continuing to be startled about just how much misinformation there is out there. And the first piece of information is the idea that we're talking about something that is properly subject to continuing negotiations. And you've seen a lot of coverage about that in the county and other. Not so. Negotiations were conducted over a 4-month period of time back in 2009. The result of that was a court order that reflected a very specific enforcement-based view of how to proceed, and that imposed specific and wide-ranging obligations on the county. Now, people are certainly entitled to disagree with the philosophy and the requirements of the decree, and maybe we'll hear some of that tonight. But court orders are there to be obeyed, like them or not. There's a very specific reason for how ill-informed the public generally has been, and it's not just the false statements that stream from the county executive's office. Civil rights defendants, and that's what Westchester is, do that all the time. The key thing to understand here is that despite the heated rhetoric that's been aimed at HUD, the reality is that those responsible for enforcing the consent decree, that means the United States Attorney and HUD and Jim Johnson, the monitor in the case, have never been willing to enforce the decree as it is written. In
Instead, and I'll be giving you some examples in my presentation tonight, they made at the beginning a decision that it was unrealistic, that is too politically explosive to do so. And as such, they have collaborated with the county in a process that has very deliberately avoided making the structural changes needed in existing residential neighborhoods. So settle in for a while. I'm going to focus this evening on a few of the basics and hope in the process to dispel some of the myths that have been circulating. And ultimately, we really face two questions. Number one, do we fundamentally believe in the rule of law, or do we only accept court rulings when they're convenient? And two, are we prepared to come to grips with the legacy of decades of intentional discrimination? In other words, there's both a legal case and a moral case to take action to get Westchester to begin to dismantle the exclusionary zoning that keeps Westchester a staggeringly segregated place, which it is. The county executive keeps on talking about how much the minority population of Westchester has expanded in the period from the 2000 census to the 2010 census. Let's look at some of the facts. The African American population in Westchester remained absolutely flat. There are still 25 towns and villages in Westchester with African American populations of under 3%, of which 19 of them have African American populations of less than 10%. I don't have as many maps as Alec did. In fact, this is my only one. But, so here we go. These are census block groups, and the bright blue represents 1% or less African American. Darker blue is up to 2%. Purple is up to 3%, and then we have two more demarcations, a darker red, which is up to 15%, and bright red, which is more than 15%. There's a lot of blue. This is not news to anybody who lives or works in Westchester. There are large areas with few or no African Americans. Now, defenders of the county like to say that there weren't any court findings against the county. You've heard this many times, I assume. Not so. The evidence was so powerful that the judge in the case found as a matter of law that Westchester had, quote, utterly failed to meet its affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations. The judge also found that every one of more than 1,000 representations that had done so were, quote, false or fraudulent. In short, Westchester didn't settle the case that the Anti-Discrimination Center brought. At the hell of it, it knew it was headed for defeat. Now, the claim is often made that anyone who can afford to live in an area can move there. Alec adverted to this in his remarks. That idea willfully ignores a history that includes the long period from the end of World War II through the end of the 1970s, at least. Here was a period of time where all the categories of players in the housing market actively kept African Americans out. Mortgage lenders, landlords, private homeowners, various levels of government. And here's a critical factor to think about. This was exactly the historical period that was marked by the greatest capital accumulation, principally capital accumulation in terms of home value. So African Americans were kept out of many places in the country, certainly including Westchester County, during the very time when it was possible for an average homeowner to build capital. If you're serious about the need for social justice, you can't ignore the need to remedy that. Just as you can't fairly ignore the fact that overly restrictive zoning continues to make new affordable housing impossible to build. I said I was going to be dealing with a bunch of myths. One is that, oh, well, the more expensive the area, the harder it would be to build. And that's not true either. A basic aspect of financing affordable housing, I should say in the first instance, is that you get more bang for the buck when you have a mixed income development. Why? First of all, it's not set off from the rest of the community, as in those people over there, but becomes part of the community. And financially, the combining of affordable units with market rate units means that part of the subsidy for the affordable units comes from the market rate ones. That is, the market rate units provide a cross subsidy. The more expensive the town or village, the more cross subsidy can be generated. And mixed income does something else. Having market rate housing prevents substandard sites from being used for affordable. People who are paying market rate are not going to move into those substandard developments. A notable feature about almost all of the housing that's been built under the consent decree is that it's not mixed income, that they're 100% affordable projects. That is the most fiscally imprudent way to proceed. It maximizes the cost per affordable unit, but it does open the door to having isolated subpar sites. Westchester always had, well, in the modern era anyway, a hands-off approach to town and village housing policy, including zoning. This is not news to anybody here. And the hands-off, voluntary approach is something that has a track record. It's a very long history of failure. It's not like, it's 2016, let's try it. It's been tried in 2006, in 1996, in the 1980s, and so forth. Municipalities have built little or no affordable housing, let alone affordable housing with desegregation potential. When there was a Housing Opportunity Commission that called for the construction of 10,000 units, for example, that was looking at housing need very conservatively defined in Westchester only, not looking at regional need beyond Westchester. Many towns and villages built nothing, zero. Many others met only a small portion of their allocation. That policy, that hands-off policy, violated the county's longstanding obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which, in simple terms, is to identify and overcome barriers to fair housing choice. I'm just going to take 10 seconds to say that the rhetoric about affirmatively furthering being a development of the Obama administration or the socialist Obama administration or they're coming to be the world government Obama administration, well, all of that's entirely false, but the affirmatively furthering being a new development is also false. The requirements to affirmatively further existed since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and the particular regulations were already in place in the 1990s. We, that is ADC, understood that towns and villages would try to maintain the segregated status quo, and that if not dealt with in the consent decree, Westchester would claim that it had no authority to deal with local zoning. It'd be great if I could get a little water.
Just for you.
Wow. Sealed and everything. I have to be a little careful, you know. We understood that there was no way to tackle the problem of continuing segregation if you took single-family zoning, sort of the most controversial piece of things, single-family zoning off the table. And there's a very simple reason for that. There's just too much of the land. The overwhelming proportion of residential land in these towns and villages that is restricted to single-family housing. If you ignore that, you guarantee that you'll never deal with overcoming the legacy of segregation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific requirements of the consent decree, and the full text of it is available here. And I really invite you to check it out. Too few reporters have done so. So the things I'm talking about tonight are not the spirit of the consent decree, which HUD letter unfortunately talked about once, but the words of the consent decree. And the first thing that Westchester was required to do was to acknowledge, that is, it's right there in black and white, acknowledge that it had the authority and the responsibility to overcome, via litigation, continuing barriers to fair housing choice, including zoning barriers imposed by its towns and villages. It's not only the Fair Housing Act that's involved, which prohibits the perpetuation of segregation. Cases from New York State's highest court make clear that state law is violated either when a municipality fails to zone for regional housing need, or when a municipality's zoning interest is outweighed by a more important county interest. And the county, in the consent decree, was required to admit that the development of affordable housing with desegregation potential is a significant public interest. In other words, home rule has never been the end of the process. It's only the beginning. When home rule butts into the Fair Housing Act or the state court doctrines I've referred to, home rule has to yield. And again, this is not a new development. The state cases were from 1975 and 1988. So that there was no misunderstanding, the consent decree made clear that this paragraph 7J, if anybody is reading along, Westchester's litigation obligation involved both taking on municipalities that had zoning barriers that would hinder the construction of units under the decree, and in addition to that, taking on municipalities whenever and wherever needed to overcome barriers to fair housing choice. And that requirement was independent of the 750 units. Is there anyone in the room who doubts the county's complete unwillingness to do this? Obviously not, because the county executive has gotten airtime on national television, county television, everywhere saying we're not going to do it. The county, of course, says that municipalities have cooperated. Of course they've cooperated. They've cooperated in maintaining the status quo, which is the only thing they've been asked to do. The county has never demanded the structural changes that it was required to demand under the decree. Despite Westchester's non-compliance, despite the monitor's belated finding after years of ignoring this, that at least in 2014, Westchester took no steps to overcome barriers to fair housing choice, neither the U.S. Attorney nor the monitor is willing to hold Westchester to account. Here's an obligation that the U.S. Attorney and the monitor won't even talk about. It's in the consent decree. Westchester is supposed to have as a goal in all of its housing policies and programs, the ending of residential segregation throughout the county. This has nothing to do with the 750 units. It's an open-ended, having that goal, and it is, as you know, been ignored completely. Not even the voluntary allocations that the Housing Opportunity Commission established remain in place. Now, 750 units in a county of almost 1 million people is a drop in the bucket. And no one thought otherwise when the consent decree was entered into. The point of the requirement was that each of the units was supposed to be a catalyst for change. If this had happened as intended, barriers existing at the time the consent decree was entered would have been demolished, opening the door for private developers, for-profit and not-for-profit, to build mixed-income housing well beyond the 750 units, and to do so in existing residential neighborhoods that are currently segregated white. Units were supposed to be built overwhelmingly, at least 84% of them, in the most white municipalities, right? Under 3% African American and under 7% Latino. Guess what? Only 50% of the units have been built in those places. And it's clear that in the end, when looking at new construction of housing open to people of all ages, so not senior housing, the percentage will be below 50%. How are the U.S. Attorney and the Monitor winking at this county non-compliance? Ready? By ignoring 2010 census data. Here we are in 2016, and they're still committed to using outdated information from Census 2000. Now, units, every one of them, were supposed to be built according to an implementation plan that affirmatively furthered fair housing. If the county failed in its obligation to come up with such a plan, that happened back in 2010, almost ancient history now, the Monitor had a mandatory obligation to put in an implementation plan of his own. Elements of that plan would then be incorporated into the consent decree and enforced just like it. Why was an implementation plan so important? It would have prevented building in isolated and substandard locations. It would have identified at the beginning the towns and villages who are most resistant to change and require the county to focus remedial efforts on them. It would have focused on building where people actually live. It would have mandated a market rate component to housing to help prevent abuse and make each unit less expensive. Never happened. The Monitor decided on his own, in direct violation of his responsibilities under the consent decree, that he didn't want to do what the consent decree required. So the obvious thing happened. Westchester put forward units that shouldn't be counted because they don't overcome barriers to fair housing choice, but the units were counted anyway. A significant portion of the units are being counted simply as an accounting trick. Some of the housing being counted was already required to be built according to some other obligation. For example, the county provided funds to Somers towards the purchase of the Angle Flyer Reserve. As part of that agreement, Somers had to make best efforts to build affordable housing or lose half the money. So some of that obligation is now being met, and it's being double counted toward the separate consent decree obligation. Similar thing in Armonk. Condition of building a market rate development was construction off-site of affordable units. You guessed it, those off-site units are being double counted toward the separate consent decree obligation. The idea of this was not to have fancy counting, it was to make change. Many units are those where the barrier was already overcome by litigation prior to the consent decree. Included in this are a 46-unit site in Larchmont and an 83-unit site in Portland. How did all the cheating go on? The answer is as simple as it is depressing. When the defendant is committed to resistance and the enforcers are afraid of enforcing and the judge is prepared to accept their joint representation that progress is being made, the cheating remains a happy secret. In those circumstances, only when the public is aroused and demands change that questions start being asked. Most of the units are clearly separated from existing white residential neighborhoods. The Larchmont development, a brownfield site, backs up on I-95 and Metro North where a former moving company used to store its trucks. The Cortland site has as its only neighbors the railroad tracks and the Veterans Administration psychiatric and substance abuse facility. The City of Rye site has 287 and 95 as its backyard. It's so close to highly Latino Worcester that to reach the public street from the development, you have to cross into Worcester. This is not an accident. You can understand it only if you realize that the improper goal shared by the county, the monitor, HUD, and the U.S. Attorney was to avoid making change to white residential neighborhoods instead of desegregating as the decree intended. Ironically, the only thing that the U.S. Attorney and the monitor want Westchester to take action on is Chappaqua Station. Another brownfield site, another site separated from residential neighborhoods, another site featuring the railroad and a major highway. What they won't deal with in the Newcastle context is the much more important fact that in the course of more than 6 years, Newcastle, like other towns, hasn't rezoned residential land in the town, let alone any single-family zone to facilitate affordable housing construction. This broader failure to change, fully supported by the county, is something that neither the U.S. Attorney nor the monitor want to deal with. Again, like it or not, the decree was designed for Westchester to use a stick. That stick would come in the form of the county acquiring interests in parcels, either directly or in conjunction with a partner, and in parcels with desegregation potential, where a municipality didn't cooperate in rezoning to allow for affordable housing, Westchester would exercise its legal rights. Not to build a high-rise next to a single-family home, but to come up with developments that involve reasonably increased density, fully compatible with any genuine environmental concerns. This is exactly why the first 2 pages of the decree forced Westchester to acknowledge its authority and responsibility to take action. There would have been no reason to recite these legal doctrines if it hadn't been contemplated that Westchester would acquire direct or indirect interests in property. Those are the circumstances where those legal doctrines are relevant. Since Westchester didn't do that, the U.S. Attorney and the monitor should have gone to court to hold the county in contempt. And then if the county still didn't act, one of those parties could have sought to have a receiver appointed to act for the county. One thing that's made moving forward difficult was the bizarre idea put forward at a hearing by the U.S. Attorney. This was after we put out our cheating on every level report. And the U.S. Attorney said, this is the entity that's supposed to be representing the United States, the people, but this is the pro-civil rights side, that the county's obligations to act against overly restrictive towns and villages wasn't triggered as long as the county did not subjectively see a problem. In other words, the U.S. Attorney was saying that the defendant, not the court, could be in charge of determining when an obligation existed. That is unprecedented and is fully contradicted by the words of the court order and all civil rights practice. Another very serious problem has been the monitor's desire to understate the scope of exclusionary zoning. Adopting a position that was criticized by major civil rights groups, including the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the monitor focused on whether African Americans were unevenly distributed within a town or village, and deliberately didn't look at how the municipality's zoning contributed to segregation in Westchester as a whole. Under the monitor's approach, a town, let's say it has 10 zoning districts that allow some kind of housing, that town could have no African Americans, and the monitor would say, no clustering, no problem. Really? No one else understands perpetuation of segregation this way. An honest analysis would find that more than 20 municipalities have zoning that perpetuates segregation, but the monitor found that politically unpalatable. So Scarsdale, with its African American population of less than 2%, with, by the monitor's calculation, 0 units of multifamily housing to meet regional need that could be built given current zoning, and with 95% of its housing units single family, the monitor found that not exclusionary. Mount Pleasant, with its principal residential zones less than 1% African American, and the ability with current zoning to build 5 multifamily units, also not exclusionary according to the monitor. The analysis was so bad that even HUD and the U.S. Attorney complained about it, but a corrected report has never been issued. Now, I'm sure if Kim were here tonight, he'd be saying that his was the only realistic approach, and it's very common for planners also to suggest that the only way to proceed is to accept barriers and try to fit your construction around those barriers. In other words, leave the barriers in place. And sometimes affordable housing can be built that way, but you never overcome racial barriers that way. Now, the first problem with this, I really have this other realistic view, barriers, is that whatever your view of the consent decree, you're supposed to enforce it. And the decree demanded going straight at the barriers. But the second, and maybe even more fundamental problem, is that this view of realism ignores all of civil rights history. Adapting to the status quo does not make defenders of the status quo more flexible. Time and time again, we have seen that appeasement only emboldens resistance. Hearts and minds are not changed by pretty pleas. That didn't happen in the direct aftermath of the Civil War. It didn't happen throughout the long history of Jim Crow. It didn't happen when officials in northern cities in the 1950s didn't have the courage to desegregate. It didn't happen in the South in the 1960s, and it didn't happen in Westchester all through the last 30 years, even as the planning department was happy to give bus tours to show that affordable housing is really innocuous. But it is really extraordinary what hold the idea of voluntarism or buy-in continues to have. It's what Paul Krugman would describe as one of those zombie ideas. And it's amazing how often this wishful thinking is described as being hard-headed. Let's be clear. You're not achieving buy-in if those you are seeking buy-in from are able to maintain their pre-existing status quo. Now, don't, ABC, entirely nonpartisan, don't think that the federal government and the monitor only retreated in response to the current county executive. You may want you to think that. From the very beginning, back when Andy Spano was county executive, the county was disclaiming, so this is in 2009, the county was disclaiming its obligations to make structural change, and those responsible for enforcement were prepared to let that happen. I remember a moment back in September of 2009 when there was the first meeting between the county legislators and the monitor. That was a meeting where the county legislators ought to have been assuring the monitor, we will obey this court order. Instead, it was Jim Johnson assuring the legislators that he wouldn't be pushing anymore. This is around the time that he said, very frankly, that rather than fighting the hard fights, he'd be looking for what he called, quote, low-hanging fruit. It's no wonder that some legislators took to calling him our monitor. The window dressing strategy has been effective in one respect, fooling many outside observers into believing that there has been real change, but if you live, as I would think almost all of you do, in Westchester, you know that's not so. So an example, there have been a handful of zoning changes in towns and villages in the last year or maybe 18 months. And those changes have been touted as ending exclusion. They haven't. Effectively, not that he's used these words, but effectively the monitor's policy with towns and villages is this. You can keep your residential zoning restrictive and segregated as they have been. Just give me something when it comes to commercial, office, or retail. And that's what the municipalities have done. The end result is the same tacit agreement that had existed and that's continued to exist. Existing white residential neighborhoods won't be disturbed in any way. What's actually realistic is to understand that genuine civil rights change comes first from law enforcement. It is changing facts on the ground that might later lead to changing hearts and minds. And even if hearts and minds aren't changed, people are entitled to have their rights vindicated. Now remember, an enforcement strategy has never been tried in terms of the key elements of the consent decree. And I just know that what will be said years from now, oh, litigation doesn't work. That's not it. The litigation got, despite the difficulties of our having to negotiate against Todd and the U.S. Attorney, got a very powerful court order. But enforcing it is something that was never tried in terms of the core elements of the decree, and that is what needs to be demanded. In my view, as I said at the outset, we don't get to pick and choose whether court orders get obeyed. When people in Oregon take over a federal land preserve, the rule of law needs to be restored. When a clerk in Kentucky won't obey an order to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, the rule of law needs to be restored. When George Wallace and other Southern leaders of the 1960s vowed massive resistance, the rule of law had to be restored. Look at the race baiting that goes on right here in Westchester. This came from the county's executive re-election campaign. We have an apartment building plunked down, and just to make sure that nobody had any doubts of what's going on here, let's bring in the invasion motif. And what's invading? Is it just higher density that's invading? What could those dark clouds possibly bring to mind? Look, Westchester is still part of the United States. Segregation, whether by intent or effect, is not permitted to be perpetuated. There's a court order that has been ignored. I know later this evening there's going to be a discussion of strategy, and there are obviously a variety of things that can be done. But the most basic thing, the most fundamental thing, it's not fancy, it's not new. The strategy is to call on the responsible parties, the U.S. Attorney, the Monitor, and HUD, to be serious about holding the county to its responsibilities. Thanks very much.
Anybody, actually, we have this microphone here if you want to come up, or you can stand and ask questions of Greg at this time. Any questions? In the back. Okay, go ahead.
Judge Cote is a pretty good judge, and she's not a shrinking violet. Why has she not been responsive to the arguments that I'm sure you've been making along these lines?
I think you described the judge well. Because of the very, very peculiar nature of the case that was brought under the False Claims Act, where the Anti-Discrimination Center was standing in the shoes of the federal government, once there was a court order, responsibility for enforcement, as it turns out, unfortunately, was exclusively in the hands of the U.S. Attorney's Office, HUD's attorney, and the Monitor, who was nominated and serves at the pleasure of HUD, and who was appointed by the judge. And so it's not terribly surprising that when you have not only Westchester saying, Judge, things are fine, but you have the U.S. Attorney and the Monitor saying, well, Judge, there are hiccups, but basically we're making progress. Basically, the units are being built, that it's a very unusual judge that would step up and say, notwithstanding that, I'm going to move forward. But, you know, just the facts are the facts. If you were just to say, could it be by random chance that all the developments avoided going into currently populated residential white neighborhoods? It just doesn't work that way, and so we're disappointed on it. We're still going to try to point this out, and that's why I think that it's important that the public step up and say that in Westchester too, the law needs to be enforced.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Fred about it. The community block grants, didn't they take away the community block grants because they weren't enforcing laws in the communities affecting money towards not-for-profits and other programs in the county?
What happened after a few years was because of one issue in the case having to do with what's called an analysis of impediments. HUD ultimately withheld money from jurisdictions. What neither HUD nor the Monitor did, since there was a separate obligation under the consent decree that said that this analysis had to be done, they've never, and I know it's very hard to imagine, but they just never went into court and said, Judge, they're violating this part of the consent decree. In terms of what happened on the funding, what you want, the reason the funding got cut off was because of something that the county was failing to do. So the burden of that is fully on the county. Now the interesting thing, or sort of the more interesting thing politically in a New York context, is that when you do cut off funds, and this again has nothing to do with the enforcement of the consent decree, as the HUD regional administrator kept on saying, we're not asking the county to do anything that every other jurisdiction isn't asked to do, which is really quite extraordinary since there's a court order that only applies to Westchester. But what happens in the circumstances, you hope that those who don't get the money will start putting pressure on the wrongdoer, here Westchester, to step up to the plate. But the county's wrongdoing found a helpful ally in the governor, who worked out this pass-through so that the money would go not to the county for distribution, but to the state for distribution, thereby taking all the pressure off the county. Thank you, Governor Cuomo. Yeah.
Would it be possible for the county, for an action to be brought for the county to be held in contempt? And if so, if the U.S. attorney was to bring that action on a practical level, would they be having a conflict of interest because they're also responsible for enforcing the consent decree, and it would be kind of an admission, or internally it would be seem like it would be a conflict for them to sort of.
No, it's really not an uncommon thing for civil rights defendants, other defendants too, but for civil rights defendants that are subject to a court order to try to evade the requirements of the court order. In the normal circumstance of private litigation, the plaintiff in the case, it's not starting a new action, you just go back to the judge, and the consent decree specifically says that the court retains jurisdiction to deal with claim interpretation and claims of violations of the consent decree. In this case, it would be the U.S. attorney or the monitor who is supposed to be reporting to the judge any problems. And it's not a reflection on anybody except for the defendant who's violating it. Is that the end of the process? No. The county would get the opportunity to say, we actually are trying to push towns and villages to change their zoning. Now, as a factual matter, that wouldn't hold up very well, but ultimately the judge would wind up making a decision. So the only kind of barrier is the same kind of barrier that you think about when you realize how little action, how little has been done by the U.S. attorney in terms of structural problems with big banks. I don't mean like an individual stockbroker or insider trading. No, the whole too big to fail idea, there's an obligation. It hasn't been carried out in that context, and it hasn't been carried out in this context either. But it happens all the time, having to go back to a judge to hold a party in contempt. That's just part of what happens. Yeah.
Is there any way that someone else outside the process, other than HUD, could make an application to the judge to enforce the law?
Well, I mean, it's possible. It's a hard road. In 2011, we tried formally to intervene, and we also said to the court, independent of whether or not you allow anti-discrimination center to intervene, enforce the decree. Westchester, the monitor, and the U.S. attorney stood up as one and said, Judge, don't get to that. Just do the motion to intervene, and the judge had the right to rule as she did. She didn't let us intervene, and that's where it stands. My own sense is that it's only serious public pressure that's going to have the opportunity to get the players who are supposed to do things to do what they're supposed to do.
Thank you, Craig, and that's what we're hoping that we'll do here tonight. So, Jim.
Meg and I have spoken on the phone. Jim Kaloran with Habitat for Humanity at Westchester. Everybody stand up for 1 second. Just get up. I'm a big one for saying. Get up. Now get down. You've been sitting for an hour, and that was a great presentation. It went quickly. Now everyone go like this. Everyone go like this. You can all come and hammer with me. That's great. I got about 20 of you going to meet with us after. So. You know, what an honor it is. And, you know, as I heard that, you know, we know the enforcement, and I'm honored to be part of this workforce coalition, housing coalition, and this is like group therapy for me to see Andrea and Dennis, and mucho bendiciones todo aquí, because we fight the fight and we get put down, but collectively this workforce coalition, and I don't want to be here tonight, you know, it should all have been ended. If the Monitor had done their job and everyone else had done their job and our politicals had done their job and everyone who said they believe in America and no segregation, and you know, and here it is, after Lyndon Johnson and the death of Dr. King, this weekend I'll have 100 volunteers, and our extended Dr. Martin Luther King Build-a-thon because of Snowmageddon. That poverty should have been ended by now. Come on! I could have built everyone a house and a vacation house. And I'm a big one for New York to have an intergenerational New York where 683,000 people left New York. Our answer to affordable housing is North Carolina, Texas, and Connecticut. Right? Less taxes. I'm out of here. I'm getting my kids through that best school right down the road where actually Habitat is building, I don't know if Greg knew, but 4 affordable home units in the town of Newcastle. And part of the best thing I did 25 years ago was to get the high schools involved. So that the white high school would go into the inner city and all backgrounds work together, and they would see, wait, I don't have to go to Nicaragua or Tennessee or down to Haiti where I saw dead bodies the first time I went after the earthquake, to see that something drastically wrong goes on in this county. And in Habitat, the founder, everyone thinks it was Jimmy Carter, it was Millard Fuller, God rest his soul, first black, white Christian community who welcome people of all faiths and no faiths. I'm honored to speak at Shabbat service. I'm just a boy that can't say no. I'm trying. But really, we used to say some of the most segregated hours of the week are Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Troy, if you didn't see. Right? When you think of it, I was brought up very segregated. I believed in God. I believed in God of Abraham we all believe in or don't believe in. But very segregated. I was taught to hate other religions, right? And there's silos. We've got a lot of silos everywhere. And I said, what's the solution? And then I inadvertently typed solution, S-O-U-L-O-T-I-O-N. What's the solution? The leadership, and I'm proud that we have all diverse leaders. We have rabbis here, ministers, priests, pastors. You have the souls of people every Friday and Saturday and Sunday to lead them out of that silo and to teach in or teach out of those walls that say, let's do it, right? So when I first came to Westchester, I was in New Jersey. I was looking, George Raymond helped with Mount Laurel, and Ridgewood, New Jersey would give money to Newark, where I used to volunteer in the Central Ward. And that was the solution for the Mount Laurel decision. And then I was in New Jersey hearing about the court order, Show Me a Hero, of Yonkers, right? Which we just saw in the cable show. I haven't seen it yet, but how many have seen Show Me a Hero? Maybe 25% of the room, if that. But Yonkers was under this federal court order of housing, right? And having been blessed to work in many neighborhoods in Yonkers, I said, geez, that court order should have been against the whole county, in my opinion. Now, it isn't because of me that this happened, okay? I'd be proud if it was, but I always said, you know, lily white, affluent, highest rating SATs and tutors to tie your shoes, and pick your BMW, go off to the Atlantis, while other kids will get shot and die in basement apartments tonight in substandard housing, where illegal housing is rampant, from Mount Kisco to Mount Vernon and New Rochelle and on, because that's our answer to affordable housing. I mean, people have died on Bond Street, where the landlord locked a family of 4 in Mount Kisco last week, when I went to visit a house on Maple Avenue with Graciela. I don't think she's here tonight, and people rent hourly rooms out, and yet there are laborers because we don't let our kids get dirty and cut lawns. Oh, what a Westchester. And when I moved into New Rochelle, the neighbors moved out. Wouldn't you if you lived next to me? No, my family and my wife is Hispanic and black, and they moved up to Rye. And it's not just the towns. I think the cities still are segregated. People don't like what I say. I think there's 2 New Rochelles, you know. And if you look at the density of the housing, it's concentrated. We're putting up 15 luxury buildings. How many can afford the luxury here? Who's moving into the luxury apartments that are coming into, come on, White Plains? But the seniors in the Esplanade are being kicked out. And where's the outcry? Where's the outcry? Man, I'm angry. I want you to be angry. We got to get whoever we hang out with angry on this, because this is everything we say we believed in. And to see a kid, 47% of kids graduate in one city and 60% in another with no art and music, while kids have every minute program till they sleep at night, is obscene. And we have presidents and wannabe presidents and governors and wannabe governors, and I have prejudiced Democrats, I have prejudiced Republicans, I said it. Right? So that's, I pull bullets out of houses. I don't want to do that anymore. I've seen people die in fires in substandard housing in this county. I don't want that anymore. So this is such a blessing to be here. You inspire me and all of us who are out in the trenches. And I brought into one of those towns, Greg said, they said, you're not bringing those people up there, are you, to build? Oh, I have a few 4-letter words that I don't want to say, that I feel like saying. And I mean, this is crazy. So may God bless us, whatever God you believe in, or don't God, but if 683,000 people are leaving New York, and we are the new Brooklyn, every day, people coming in to buy Restore 659 Main Street for all your housing needs, that's right. People coming up from Brooklyn, 101 57th. $70 million for a condo. How many can afford that? Hello, and they're only living in it for a weekend. So everybody's gentrifying out here, and everyone's then, all the cities saying, we better get on this bandwagon, let's put up more luxury. And then we're, ¿dónde está? La persona trabaja en la candado aquí. Vive. Where is everybody living? I don't know if that was Vive correct. Spanglish. Right? The futuro, our future. Orange County is our answer to affordable housing. The Tappan Zee Bridge was never meant for the amount of cars. Travel an hour and a half. So that's kind of what, I didn't want to be here tonight, Alex, you know that. Pain and the God's blessing to help and keep fight this. So we are here with another a person here, one of the people. And it's an honor to see if I can pull it up on there. I couldn't print off your bio. But one of the things that Kevin said, I asked him, what are you most passionate about? He's a land use lawyer, right? At Pace University, and he has great degrees and great expertise. And he said, I'm excited that I've I see neighborhoods change. And he said, I pick up hammers even. A lawyer picks up a hammer, right? Everybody can pick up a hammer. And he said, I've been working in Newburgh a lot. You know, where kids get shot at, and we see some of that. So I'm just going to briefly read his bio. And I'm sorry I took a minute. But Kevin Dworker is a land use and economic consultant specializing in urban revitalization, a senior fellow of Pace Land Use Law Center. He helps municipalities, real estate developers, and transit agencies unlock the economic value of rail stations, RAIL, and maximize the fiscal benefits of station area properties. Over the course of his 20-year career, Kevin has held senior positions at the MTA, Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, and the Israel Union for Environmental Defense. In the past, Kevin has taught land use at NYU, urban economic development at the City University of New York, and Israel politics at Yeshiva University. His dissertation at Hebrew University in Jerusalem examined the use of global capital and public-private partnerships for financing light rail projects in Israel, United Kingdom, and the United States. He received his BA from Columbia University, JD from Pace Law School, MCP from UC Berkeley, and PhD from Hebrew University. Kevin practiced before the New York State Bar and serves on the New York City Bar Association Housing and Urban Development Committee, serving on the board of the New York chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism. He is capable of providing a full suite of litigation support services, including expert testimony, real property valuation, and technical land use, traffic, and environmental impact documents. A licensed land use attorney, he also helps mediate community land use and consensus building and conflict resolution strategies. More importantly, he's a great guy, he's got a good heart, and he's very well educated to address us tonight. Can we hear for Kevin Dworker?
Thank you for having me here tonight. It is so exciting to see a room full of people who are passionate about affordable housing, as am I. I have a practice, though, that goes far beyond housing issues. I deal with transportation, I deal with local economic development, I deal with urban design, I deal with parking and fire hydrants and sanitation and garbage, the full gamut of issues that define the overall quality of life in a city. And I work a lot in the Hudson Valley. I have to make a disclosure that I do come here from Brooklyn every day. I kind of feel like I'm part of the old Brooklyn. And I am on the train almost every single day, to tell you the truth, coming into the Hudson Valley and serving the communities up and along the river. And I've really had the experience to be on the ground with these communities and to talk with residents and to work intimately with the mayors and the council members and the department heads. And my hope today is to give you a window into the way in which I advise localities to create an equitable city, an equitable environment, an inclusive city, an affordable city. But as you'll see from my presentation, I go above and beyond the housing issue and do not leave it into a silo. And I want to explain more about what I mean by that. So I'll navigate you through some of the guiding principles and strategies that we each day in my practice try and get buy-in from the communities to further. And I'll be very upfront with you about the successes and the failures, and where things have gone well and where things continue to require a lot more education. I also just want to say from the get-go, it's true, I am a land use attorney and I practice that in New York City, but I take that hat off when I come to the Hudson Valley, and I put on my community planner hat, and I work here in much more of a collaborative capacity. I don't work on litigation. I'm glad we had a presentation here that really looked critically at the full gamut of legal issues surrounding the Westchester County consent decree. I am of the opinion that 750 units of housing is a start, but there's a long journey that goes beyond that in terms of social and economic equity. And tonight, I'll talk about what some of those challenges are beyond the 750. So let me just get my technical bearings.
You seem to be pretty good with computers too.
Check that out. Acrobat experience. So this is my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I like to show Brooklyn to the communities that I work in, some of which are poor, some of which are affluent. But one of the things that's really helpful about showing Brooklyn is its walkability. And I know Brooklyn has got the reputation for being a hyper-gentrified part of the country and has become somewhat of a caricature of itself, and that's probably true. But it doesn't change the fact that there's some powerful lessons here about the urban form and the design of the neighborhoods. And there's a reason why Brooklyn is so hot as a place to live, which is because the walkability aspects of it truly create a very deep sense of community. Now, there's many reasons why people in certain communities may oppose affordable housing, and one of them may in fact be racial animus. I have been in meetings with elected officials, and I've heard comments that I wouldn't say are subtextual, but explicitly racist when it comes to contemplating affordable housing. But it's not the only reason why people oppose affordable housing in Westchester County. There are a variety of associations, and one of them is a lingering association of affordable housing as large-scale towers in the park in evacuated neighborhoods that are high in crime and presumed to be bad places to raise children. Now, whether that's true or not, I think is highly debatable. I think in New York City, we actually have some phenomenal neighborhoods, including luxury neighborhoods that have towers in the park. However, the term affordable housing sometimes conjures up images of a certain scale of building that people do not want to see in their community, and I'm aware of that. The pendular swing has gone in the direction of glorifying the single-family home. Many people who are living in metropolitan New York are escapees from the city. They don't want to go back. They went to the single-family lifestyle for a reason. But there's something in between, and it's something that we're increasingly calling middle housing, which I think is a good term, which is a housing that's at a human scale, that's walkable, that's pedestrian friendly, that's maybe 3 stories in density, and a scale that in fact would work well in areas that are urban, as well as areas that are lower density, but could potentially accommodate a greater level of density, a Brooklyn-style density. So in the image that I'm showing you here, and we can make the presentation available to you, I just want to show you the drawing that illustrates the zoning concepts that define my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And you can see in this, it's not a tower in the park concept. It's called the Quality Housing Program that rolled out in the late 80s. And the idea was to create buildings that were flush with the street edge, that had adjoining structures next to each other, that were not fronted by a parking scape, that had a human scale with restrictions up to 50 feet maximum, that placed parking in the back, that allowed for a multiplicity of units, that allowed for there to be a mixture of studios and 1-bedrooms and 2-bedrooms within the same building, and that allowed a lot coverage of up to 80%. Now, tonight's not the night to walk you through all of the sort of technical jargon of lot coverage and floor area ratios, but I just want to impress upon you that sometimes when I show an image like this to communities that are hostile to the idea of affordable housing, it does give them pause to know that there is a way to create density that feels human scale, that does not conjure up for them the scary tall building in the sky. Some people want to live in the tall building in the sky, but there's many who would be living right now, who are living right now in a single family home. And if this was an option for them close to a train station, if this was the option for them to place their aging parents, for them to have an option for their children after they go to college to come home to, as an option for them to be able to support workforce housing, they might say yes. And it's a reason why we do educate our cities about the options and tools that are available to them through urban design and zoning. Now let me insert my skepticism. There's a whole theory out there called, architectural determinism, which really suggests that the design of the spaces and the way in which they look has a profound effect on the way that people interact and perceive themselves, and there may be some truth to that. But my own personal professional experience of being in the Hudson Valley is that while physical image has something to do with the fears and objections to affordable housing, it's actually a relatively small part. And I want to walk you through some of the challenges that I have found in many ways to be even larger than the physical associations. Let me start with the market. There is this idea that all of my hipster friends in Brooklyn are going to come and save the struggling cities of the Hudson Valley, that Williamsburg 20-somethings will all be moving into these cities along the river and upgrade and repair the housing stock. And one of my clients for many years now has been the city of Newburgh, and the image I'm showing you is one of the dilapidated buildings in the heart of Newburgh. And when I first got to Newburgh and started working there, I think that there was a lot of hope that as I did the market analysis, the conclusion that I was going to make was that yes, we could support a lot of luxury condos for the Brooklyn millennials. We can support some, but two caveats. A, there's not enough of them at this particular juncture. I'm not saying there won't be in 2, 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years, but at this particular juncture, it is not as though that the demand in the market in the most distressed parts of Newburgh are going to be salvaged by that level of gentrification at this moment. It may change. But the other piece here is that when I actually looked at the demand for housing in a city with high levels of vacancy, when I actually looked at what type of housing was needed by the community that was living there, we found that in fact there was a demand for affordable housing when you look at it from a market and economic perspective. We looked at statistics similar to what we've seen earlier this evening about the high percentages of families that are cost burdened in this area. And while there may be very high amounts of vacant buildings, those aren't habitable buildings that are providing a high quality of living. When we look at the availability and supply of studios and one-bedrooms, we're seeing a lot of working people unable to afford the units that they need to fit the size of their families. And when we look at the surrounding region, Newburgh, other localities, to see, well, can they move there? Could they find the housing they need in those locations? The answer is no. So this leads to a somewhat uncomfortable conclusion for someone who thinks gentrification is going to be the antidote to Newburgh's recovery, which is that in fact, we don't need less affordable housing in Newburgh. We need more. We need affordable housing to help stabilize these blocks and ensure that the vacant parcels do not continue into an ongoing cycle of distress and foreclosure and flipping, but actually become habitable places for communities to build and recover. And so it was with the basis of that analysis that I then worked on the Newburgh Neighborhood Revitalization Plan with a housing composition reflecting the conclusions that we made about the types of housing that would be needed in the area. Let me move on to the issue of Chappaqua, which I know is on so many people's mind, and it is on mine as well. My firm was engaged to draft the update to Newcastle's comprehensive plan. We also did the revitalization plan for the downtown Chappaqua train station area, as well as for the hamlet of Millwood. All three of those projects commenced in February 2015, and they closed in December 2015. So I'm very intimate with this particular part of Westchester. The image I'm showing you here is the site of the Conifer 28-unit affordable housing building, which Craig alluded to in his previous presentation. And as he correctly notes, this is currently the only sort of real affordable housing project in Newcastle and Chappaqua, with the exception of another one that has more recently started to unfold. And it is situated in a very awkward place. You might be asking, well, where's downtown Chappaqua? There's no downtown Chappaqua to be seen here. It's true that it's a 3-minute walk from the Chappaqua train station, but it's hemmed in between a rail alignment and an exit road from, an arterial, and it is a clumsy place for anyone to live in, let alone for it to be an entirely affordable housing development. And so we inherited this, if you will, as an assumption. This project is especially controversial because the units here play an important role, or have played an important role in the fulfillment of the Westchester County consent decree. We saw what was going on here, couldn't honestly get involved. It was beyond the purview and scope of my firm's involvement. But as we commenced the Newcastle Comprehensive Plan, and as we undertook the Chappaqua and Millwood revitalization strategies, we started from the get-go to look proactively at how can we work with this community in trying to identify their affordable housing needs for themselves. What would it take for them to be able to entertain a different range of options regarding housing within their community? And it's very interesting because sometimes, and I find this in a lot of places where I work, if you say, do you want affordable housing? The answer is no, I do not. But if you say, do you want a place where you can age in place in your community that's not a single family home on a 2-acre lot, or do you want a place for your child to be able to come home, or do you want a place to ensure that all of the service folks in your community have a place to live, you may get a very different answer. I know people are surprised when I say this, but in the year that I was working in Chappaqua, we did not hear a large volume of people criticizing affordable housing. We heard people critical of the project in terms of its location here, but as we threw out concepts and ideas for introducing mixed income and mixed use housing within downtown Chappaqua, within downtown Millwood, we had productive conversations. Now, how do these conversations materialize into a codification? How do they get adopted into zoning is something that remains to be seen. But I want you to understand at least the complexity here in terms of, yes, there being a historical objection to affordable housing that has been reported in this community, and yet when we actually started to have the conversations about the community's needs, they went in a lot of different ways with a lot of different people. So that is the Chappaqua experience. I want to talk about another project which is in White Plains here. And it's one that I think is a very good example of the opportunity we have right now to be thinking critically about the connections between affordable housing and social equity and economic development. The White Plains Station, as many of you know, and this is in the image, it sits on a considerable amount of surface parking, and it is proximate to a central business district. this is an ideal place for really pushing the envelope on affordable housing. And the reason is because when a household is lower income, if you look statistically, their levels of car ownership also go down considerably. They're far more transit dependent. And so if affordable housing is located in a lower density suburban area that is far from transit and far from job opportunities and far from educational centers, it creates a further bifurcation. Now, from a legal perspective, from the interest of an integrationist perspective, it may very well be appropriate to situate affordable housing in those lower density areas. And I think that the power of the school districts and the implications they have on the opportunities for young people is important to acknowledge as well. But when I do look at White Plains, and I do look at the proliferation here of businesses that we have, and the presence of educational institutions, and the concentration here, we have a real opportunity as we now go forward in reinventing the land use plan for White Plains to do something dramatic, to really create a model in which the transportation, in which the transit linkages, and the economic development and social equity and affordable housing are seamlessly linked so that the residents here truly have a set of opportunities that they may not otherwise have in a different location. So that's White Plains and the transportation side. And then I want to talk lastly here about the project that I've been working on also for the last 3 years in the city of Poughkeepsie. And this has been, like Newburgh, a challenging place to work in terms of dealing with the cyclical effects of poverty, the institutionalization of poverty going from generation to the next generation, a hollowing out of the city, a hollowing out of opportunity. And yet, the city of Poughkeepsie is ripe with some incredible assets. It's got Vassar College, it's got Marist, it's got Dutchess Community College, it's got Vassar Brothers Medical College. It has these powerful anchor institutions. And our mission has been to work on the revitalization of Poughkeepsie and to provide for the needs of this existing community, which like Newburgh, mean providing a high-quality supply of affordable housing. But as we're undertaking this initiative, we are concurrently trying to work with the business community and the universities to create a set of opportunities that are linked to the redevelopment of the neighborhoods. So it's a tricky undertaking, but like transportation, if you will, if you plan affordable housing in a vacuum from the transportation linkages, then we've ignored the access to economic opportunity. And similarly, if we go forward in Poughkeepsie with an inclusionary housing ordinance, which I think is what we will very likely do and can provide 10 or 20% affordable housing for infill strategies, that's great, but it still isn't going to make a dent in terms of the cross-generational poverty of the existing population if we don't find a different strategy for creating a ladder from the high school to the community college to the key employers. So we're trying multiple tacks from the perspective of community engagement, from land use and zoning instruments and tools, to coordination between land use and transportation, to the harnessing of the corporate entities and higher education to pave a different way toward revitalization of these communities. And with that, I'll close. And then, is this a time for me to take questions, or?
Yeah. Any questions here?
So we are planning some
By the way, I want to concur in Chappaqua. We're building 4 units there, Habitat is, and which is very well received, and I appreciate that. and a lot of volunteers from there over the years. So that's both in Chappaqua and Millwood. I found the same thing. Let's go to a question.
One of the things that has concerned me as I've watched not just the settlement be worked on, but a lack of developers who seem to be willing to come into the county and do mixed income development. If I look at the trends around the country, that's kind of the way to go. And I guess Mr. Gurian mentioned it too. But I was wondering why you think that has been such a problem in Westchester?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I would concur with the previous speaker that it makes tremendous sense for new housing development to be mixed income for similar reasons as he cited, and I would also say it is considered a best practice in urban planning, as you note, to move away from the hyper concentrations of affordable housing in undesirable areas. Why has it been difficult to pull off? Well, one of the key issues has been the financing structures for affordable housing and the limitations that many of the programs at the federal and state level place upon the mix of housing that can be within a certain development. And in many cases, it works out from a financial perspective as well from a regulatory perspective that the entire affordable housing development needs to be all affordable, subject to restrictions, which results in this kind of bifurcated environment of either, well, it's either all luxury or it's all affordable. We are undertaking, though, we're undergoing a policy shift, and we're seeing changes in that as more and more financing programs are beginning to explore new instruments for promoting middle-income housing. We're seeing it in the private finance community. We're seeing it in Albany and in new innovations that are coming up in housing finance through housing and community renewal. I think it's taken us a while to get here. I think it's probably many years late in coming, but it is changing, and the philosophy is changing.
And if I may, I just want to point out something that I found interesting. Conifer, who's trying to build the 28-unit development in Chappaqua, in this time it has taken them to not even get their building permits in Chappaqua, was able to go into Nassau County and build a 200-unit development that goes from 30 to 120% AMI for that area. So I'm really questioning, I guess, the county's outreach to foster that type of development. Obviously, Nassau County seems more that likely.
Well, I know the county is supporting that project. I don't know all the complexities of the answer. I know the people, a lot of people, like Kevin said, find that, and people, there are people in this room who disagree, that project next to the Sawmill River and the train station is really unacceptable for any human habitation. And that's what some of the, I'm just telling you, that's some of the feeling. Some people here feel that's, if I can get my kids into the Chappaqua school system and I can hop on a train, but so there's a lot of the populace there. I know the funding is there, and they have the county. I think we have we may have a county representative who can speak on that here too. But and again, this is not. But I think we're going to continue on, and we're going to go to our next speaker. And I want to really thank Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Reverend Troy, who is here, and he's going to introduce our next speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I was sitting so long I couldn't get up. I almost fell backwards. Isn't this a great teaching? Haven't we learned a lot? I'd like to thank Alex and Jim for great work and great effort, as well as for all of the speakers. who took time, thought this out, who has been in the forefront to fighting the injustices that exist within our county. And I just, as point of protocol, we did have, in terms of clergy, I represent the ICSA, and that's the Interfaith Clergy for Social Action. For Westchester, we are the largest interfaith clergy in Westchester. And we had this evening with, I think some have left as well, but we have this evening, we have clergy Bart Wooden, Reverend Noel D'Amico, Reverend Noel Vanek, Rabbi Sharon Milgrove, Reverend Lillian Reynolds, and also Reverend Saul Rodriguez. And our speaker will be Reverend Dr. Betty Cobb. It is great, and if I overlook any clergy that did come that's still here, just acknowledge yourself so we can recognize you. If not, I have the privilege to introduce our speaker. You know, one of the things, and it was being mentioned in a lot of the presentation, mentioned also about racism and so forth. But our perspective also, it's not just about racism, it's classism as well. And also, this is about human rights. It's not civil rights, it's human rights. Everyone is entitled to have a home. Everyone is entitled to have a roof over their head and a floor beneath their feet. And that's what this fight is about. Because the problem is, in a lot of cases, when we put it in the context of racism, then we also get the imagery, okay, this is about serving poor blacks, poor Hispanics, and so forth. And that kind of, a lot of people, when we get into the concept of the not in my backyard concept, and then people aren't so much willing to participate. But if we start thinking about this as a human rights issue, human rights, we're all human. And this world is small. It's not as big as we think it is. And we all have to get along, to work together, live together, worship together, to be able to commune with one another. And that needs to be the focus of all of our efforts in this matter. So we thank you for coming out and participating in this event and for all the great leadership that's here. And I have the privilege, and I can't pull up her bio, the bio's too long. She has done so many great things. Reverend Dr. Betty Thomas is the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Mount Vernon. She sits on many boards, and she operates in capacities to address civil and human rights issues. She's also the chair of the Educational Committee for the ICSA. She's actively involved in almost every area within society, from economics to educational to social justice. She's well-rounded, well-trained, and she is the right person to speak to us this evening. So let's welcome the Reverend Dr. Betty Thomas. Her husband, also Reverend Dr. Derswell Tom, as well, said.
Good evening. Well, I have less slides than Alex and Craig and Kevin. I have none. So I'm going to ask whoever's in charge of this if you will shut that down for this short period of time. If you'll shut this, just close it. Okay. And it'll automatically. Okay, great. Because I want to invite you to see. I want to invite you to see. With your hearts, with your minds, with your souls. So my task here tonight, informed by the scriptures, my task here this evening is to speak on the moral cause and the moral case for the community's responsibility to provide affordable housing, number one, to share with you a real-life experience of a faith community and what they have done around affordable housing. And then finally, to list some actions that I believe the faith-based community can and should take in order to help end this government-authorized racial and economic segregation right here in Westchester County. A very familiar yet powerful scripture informs this issue. Luke chapter 10, verse 25 to 29. Listen. Just then, a religious scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. Teacher, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus answered, what is written in God's law? The religious scholar said, that you love the Lord your God with all of your passion, with all of your prayers and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Good answer, said Jesus. Now do it, and you shall live. But looking for a loophole, the scholar asked, and who is my neighbor? Jesus then goes on to teach this wonderful parable of the Good Samaritan to show us that neighbor has nothing to do with geography. It has nothing to do with citizenship or race. Wherever and whenever people need us, there we can be neighbors. Just like Christ, we can show mercy. This is the essence of hospitality. And so in biblical times, hospitality was the foundation for all morality. This principle of radical hospitality was and still is the benchmark of the ministry of Christ. In the Merriam-Webster dictionary, hospitality can be defined as the quality or disposition of receiving and treating guests and strangers in a warm, friendly, and generous way. And in the New Testament, the Greek word translated hospitality literally means love of strangers. Hospitality, my brothers and sisters, is a virtue that is both directed and praised all throughout the scriptures. So theologically and ethically, it is therefore immoral and unjust to deny people the right to safe, clean, decent, accessible, affordable, and permanent housing.
That's right.
Amen?
Amen.
Decent housing is not a white privilege, nor an entitlement. But decent housing is a divine right of every person, regardless of their race, their age, their gender, or ethnicity. Thankfully, some Christian traditions and denominations have written statements of affirmation on this issue of affordable housing. And with much vision and grace, some churches have even responded with radical hospitality. In accordance with the Presbyterian Church USA statement from the Advisory Committee on Social Witness, I affirm that the church is called to a ministry of hospitality. I affirm that the church is called to help create communities of hospitality that assure that all members of the society have a right to the basic economic and social well-being, which includes safe, affordable housing. And I affirm that the church is called to challenge society, to be a prophetic witness to society, in this area of affordable, safe, decent, accessible, and permanent housing, particularly for persons who cannot secure such housing by their own means. One such congregation took seriously this call to be a prophetic and inclusionary community in regards to this issue. Members of the Arlington Presbyterian Church in Arlington, Virginia, they asked themselves, how do we seek to follow Christ's mission? And what and to whom does our heart break? So for weeks, the members of this congregation canvassed their neighborhood, their working class neighborhood. And they asked the people in the stores and those who worked in the community, they asked them, what is your greatest need? The same response came back over and over again. We cannot afford to even live in this community any longer. After months of prayer and reflection by the leaders of the Arlington Presbyterian Church and its congregation, that church made the radical but gracious decision to sell its building, its parking lot, and its grounds to the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. It took years of hard work. You know, we Presbyterians don't do anything slow, right? It took years of hard work and lots of red tape. But the APAH has received the approval to tear down the church structure and to replace it with 173 affordable apartments. The congregation will then rent ground floor space in the new apartment building so that it can continue to worship at the same site. Other congregations such as the First Baptist Church of Clarendon, Virginia, and St. James United Methodist Church in Arlington, Virginia, they have also sold or decreased their worship space in order to make it possible for affordable housing to be built for those in their community who need it the most. Additionally, along with selling church property in order to make room for affordable housing, there are several other actions that faith communities can undertake. In preparation for this teaching, I went online and I searched all of the known places of worship in Pelham, in Buchanan, in Harrison, in Scarsdale, in North Salem, in Newcastle, Port Chester. And what I found will not surprise you. There are numerous places of worship of all faiths in these towns. I challenge the leaders of these faith communities, in these hamlets and villages and towns that go on record as NIMBY supporters. I challenge you to stand up and to speak up for the least of these and the last of these, the very people whom Christ in his ministry championed. Churches can make a critical difference in at least 3 significant areas. First, by getting involved with partnerships that help create affordable housing, such as CHI. Secondly, churches can support and advocate for legislation that creates housing, trust funds at the city, state, and national levels. And thirdly, listen to me, faith leaders. Faith leaders can be authentic and relentless voices of justice, especially in these NIMBY supporting communities. As people of faith and communities who profess to be hospitable and neighborly, we are not to squander our precious time looking for governmental loopholes, enacting municipal exclusionary zoning codes, or devising ways to continue to be non-compliant concerning enforcement of the existing anti-discrimination laws in regards to affordable housing. These blatant practices serve solely to exclude people based on race, age, gender, ethnicity, from securing their basic right to decent and affordable housing. Again, the PCUSA Committee on Social Witness wrote, universal access to safe, decent, accessible, affordable, and permanent housing is a measure of a truly just society and a sign of the coming reign of God. In 1965, from Montgomery, Alabama, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech entitled, "Our God is Marching On." In this infamous speech, Dr. King responded to the question, how long must African Americans wait for equality and justice in America? We here tonight may be asking that same question in regards to this issue of affordable workforce housing in Westchester County, New York. How long will it take before our opponents understand that all people have the right to decent housing? How long will it take before they act justly? I leave you with a quoted response from Dr. King's speech. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Amen.
That was a very inspiring speech, and I just want to share with you that the people that oppose us know they're wrong. They know they're wrong. And if you can shame them sometimes, it's more effective than a consent decree or a court order. Back in October, when we founded the Westchester Workforce Housing Coalition, it was over a project that the MTA was doing in Harrison, New York. Harrison, New York is 2/3 the size of Manhattan and has not created one affordable unit in 25 years. It was given an allocation by Westchester County itself to do 756 units, and they hadn't done one. And yet the MTA was doing a deal in downtown Harrison for 143 units with a developer named Avalon, in which not one unit was going to be affordable. In fact, the mayor boasted that every one of those units was, quote, luxury housing that wouldn't add any children to their school district, because that's what it's about. And so we looked at this and we said, that's wrong, and we're not going to let this happen. And so we gave a speech before the MTA, and we denounced this, and we said, this can't happen. This is a public resource. This is MTA land. This is from a public benefit corporation, not to allow any affordable housing. We stopped that project, even though there had been a negotiated deal between the MTA, Avalon, and Harrison. We stopped that deal, just with one speech. And then finally, we even forced the county to get involved. The monitor got involved, wrote a letter to the county and said, hey, remember that consent decree that you signed that said that you're obligated to litigate even if necessary? Well, they sent the deputy county executive, and they had some really hard nose, and they knocked some heads. And they got, for the first time, some affordable housing. Wasn't a lot. 7 units. Wasn't a lot, but it broke a barrier. And I can tell you that there's another project, 421 units now. And that's going through the approvals process. And I can assure you that even though we haven't gotten it yet, we will have affordable housing in that project, in that development. I can guarantee it. We can't do it without you, though, and that's the purpose of this. This is not an educational exercise here. And I'm hoping that you will give us your emails, and show up when we come to call people to account who are right now getting away with this because nobody is bothering to challenge. That's it. But we do have one person in the media who has been with us right from the beginning. David McKay Wilson, the Tax Watch columnist for the Journal News, actually convened the first meeting of the Westchester Workforce Housing Coalition at the Harrison train station. And many of his articles have been written very avidly by the Monitor, the Federal Monitor, because he tends to use those articles in his letters to the county and to the court. David has been a reporter for the New York Times, a reporter for the Journal News, and is now the Tax Watch columnist, is indisputably the man on affordable housing in the media. David?
Thank you, Al, so much for inviting me this evening. And thanks to those who spoke before me, the lawyer Craig, the planner Kevin, the preacher Betty. I'm just a journalist. But I've found since coming to Westchester 30 years ago, I've been writing about housing policy for 30 years. And I quickly learned when I came here that when you get right down in the trenches of the warfare over affordable housing, you can make a difference. Journalists, I've found, can help set the public agenda on housing, can call attention to injustice, and be a real player at the highest levels in this unfolding saga. Now, I cut my journalistic teeth on housing back in the late 70s in Cambridge, Massachusetts, covering the rent control battles in that city. When I came to Westchester in 1986, I came right here to White Plains, covered White Plains City Hall. At that time, the homeless crisis was in full blossom. The county was paying $3,000 a month for a room at the Coachman Hotel. And the Reverend Peter Larum at Grace Episcopal Church wanted to build a homeless shelter on East Post Road. I don't know if you remember that battle. It was one of the great ones. White Plains Mayor Al Del Vecchio stood proudly in opposition. But I chronicled that struggle, and I felt the energy of God's people who wanted to provide housing for their fellow man. I was in Yonkers a few years later for the housing desegregation case. I was at City Hall that night on that hot summer evening when they had that climactic vote at 1 a.m. in the morning, and Nick Longo cast that decisive vote, and they called him Judas. And they rocked his car out on City Hall Plaza, and they finally built the housing. I continued writing about housing when then housing hero Andrew Cuomo was establishing the West Help project in Valhalla. And I wrote about that weird deal they had to forge to make that happen, where they ended up turning over the housing, the 108 affordable efficiency apartments, to the town of Greenburgh, which had no experience in managing housing. My investigation in 2006 uncovered the illegal deal between the town of Greenburgh and the Valhalla School District, where they were funneling $650,000 a year from the West Help proceeds to the school district to mollify the opposition from the families in that neighborhood in Greenburgh. And what would they do with that money? Well, they had cut-rate tickets to the Metropolitan Opera, matinees, dinner cruises around Manhattan, and a $42,000 trip for 20 students and 4 teachers to the Grand Canyon. You know, I dug out that story from 2006 when I was preparing for this talk, and it hit me that Westchester's housing shame could be summed up in a quote that I ended that story with by Greenberg Supervisor Paul Feiner, who was giving a description of why this neighborhood needed this, what he called it, the social dividend. The social dividend, this is what this money was, the social dividend to these Mayfair Knollwood homeowners who were allowing homeless women and their children to live in this housing complex surrounded by an 8-foot fence, topped with barbed wire, that was through the woods from their neighborhood. And here's the quote I ended that story with, and it really struck me when I read that the other day. He says, "You might not think government should be doing this. And a trip to the Grand Canyon is not the typical kind of trip you'd offer a kid. But this is what it takes for a neighborhood to support homeless housing in their backyards." So when I returned to the Journal News, I took a few years off to pursue a freelance career. But when I came back in 2012, I went immediately to take this job as a tax watch columnist. I returned to Greenberg and to the West Office. Hey, what was happening with that? And lo and behold, Greenberg was preparing to raise the 108 units, tear them down, and make room for a campus for a school for the disabled that was very connected politically. My columns raised the awareness of the demolition threat and the support of Westchester County Executive Rob Astorino to tear down the housing in the district he once represented as a county legislator. I put the Cuomo administration on notice that I was watching, and the public was watching, what was about to happen to Andrew's pride and joy. Well, the state stopped the demolition. Those units remained vacant and deteriorated. Remember, it has been more than 4 years since the town of Greenberg has had possession of these apartments for the sole purpose of providing affordable housing. I think that it's high time for Westchester County to find Greenberg in default of its contract so we can preserve this publicly owned housing resource. However, I really don't expect any leadership on West Help from either the Republicans or the Democrats in the county who have shown really very little interest in preserving this housing. Back in October of 2014, I received a call from Alec, who was bending my ear about the latest outrage in the Westchester affordable housing front. This was the town of Harrison wanted to build these units, and they had this deal with the MTA, no affordable, and not one single unit of the 756 built. The tip from Roberts, who is a former TV newsman, by the way, so he knows what news is, that held promise in my hunt for my next column. I'm always looking for one. But I needed visuals and on-the-record comments. So a week or so later, Alec informed me that he'd rallied several local leaders to meet for the photo. Grace Heyman, Executive Director of the Westchester Hispanic Coalition, Jim Kaloran from Habitat, Chuck Pateman, a local developer, Lena Anderson from the NAACP in Greenberg, and Dennis Hanratty, Mount Vernon United Tenants.
Yeah, Dennis.
And his dog.
And his dog. That photo session, it turned out, was the first meeting of what became the Workforce Housing Coalition. My column laid out the argument for housing there. Harrison had refused to adopt Westchester's model ordinance that would require 10% of the units to be affordable. Harrison Mayor Ron Belmont wanted only luxury units, and he maintained that the median price of a rental in Harrison of close to $1,700, that was affordable because it cost you $4,000 a month if you owned a house there. And then I got Rob Astorino to say that I ambushed him after a press conference, and I got him to say that, you know what, that's a good place for, because he was under pressure to build the housing. He says, yeah, that's a good place for housing. So this set up a fascinating kind of structure here, that we had the county executive on record in favor of the housing, but then we had the MTA, of which all 20 members of the MTA board appointed by Andrew Cuomo, our great housing hero. So it made a very interesting dynamic, because during the gubernatorial campaign, Cuomo had criticized Astorino for not doing enough for affordable housing. So I think that column helped spark some action. Alec, they went to the MTA asking for 20% of the units, and then Jim Johnson, the housing monitor, sent a stern letter to the county saying, where are the Harrison units going to be built, and what are you doing to build them? By March, so this was 5 months later, they had the agreement on the 7 units. 5%, but it was a start. Now, that
And
letter...
where are the other 700 going to be built?
Huh?
Where in Harrison are the other?
Yeah, well...
No, I'm sorry. I listened for 3 hours about the issue I thought was segregated Westchester, okay? Now, at 7 units in Harrison, that must raise their population from 0 to 1/10 of 110. We can all come back here in 50 years and say, gee, only white people live in Harrison. Only white people live in Pelham. Are you people serious or on crack? I'm sorry. What a waste of my time. I mean, 7 units, give me a break.
So what did you do to get more?
What did I do?
Yeah, I want to know what
don't
you
live in
did.
Harrison. I live
Where
in
do you live?
Mamaroneck Village.
Okay, I
And
can't.
we have quite
You have
a
quite a
few.
few.
Thank you.
Well, I have to say,
But
Mamaroneck Village.
town has nothing.
But
You're right, that's true.
part of what this is
That's what this is
about
all about.
is for us all to work together and to
Thank
take it from here, including you. And we're
Working
grateful.
together for 7 units in Lily White Harrison in 2016.
But they never had any, and we need 700 and we need you.
Yeah, you have to do something.
Right.
Whatever you want me to do, I'll walk up and down the street.
Thank you, thank you.
I put myself where my mouth is.
Thank you.
Very positive.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. As I was saying,
We need more people like her.
thank you.
We need more people like her. Because it is an outrage. It's an absolute outrage. And let me just say, I just want to interject something. Because I speak to the monitor. And you know what? He's frustrated. He's very frustrated. Because everybody's looking to him to do everything. And he feels, frankly, he feels like he's not supported. And I understand that. I really do. I know Craig disagreed. Craig says he doesn't need to be supported. He has a consent decree. He has a legal document to do it. And I agree with him. And that's his job to do it. And why doesn't he do it?
Why isn't he fired by now?
But why is it, that is what I'm asking. You know, that's what I'm asking. That's what the purpose, this is the purpose. We need to get through organized, exactly. We need to get organized and direction where people will do that. I guarantee you that, and I've seen it time and again, the opposition knows they're wrong. They know they're wrong. It's obvious. It's so obvious. They fold like a cheap suit. They will. They will fold like a cheap suit. Like, give me 10 people like her, and we'll confront. We'll go to 148 Martine Avenue. We'll go before the legislature, and we'll demand that they do what they're supposed to do, that they should have done for the past 30 years. But you want to say, David?
Well, only.
Go ahead. Sorry. I'm really sorry.
That's okay, that's okay. Thank you,
We're going
thank
to
you.
have a panel after David.
Okay, so, as I was saying, that the letter from the housing monitor marks the beginning of a very unusual relationship that I developed with him. Unusual, I say, because I've actually never spoken to the man, nor will he return my phone calls. But he reads my column and responds. In October, I turned my sights on the luxury Cambion development in Mamaroneck on the edge of downtown Larchmont, along the highway and the tracks, which was, and I discovered that the Astorino administration wanted to hand over $1.3 million to the developer so that 10 of the units would qualify as affordable condominiums to fulfill the 750 unit benchmark. I questioned whether I read the consent decree. I talked to Craig on the phone. We talked that one out. And I read the consent decree. And I came to realize that the approvals for these 10 affordable units had been done in 2006 before the consent decree was signed. That these were already, they were already in the pipeline, and under the agreement, they could only count if the public money was needed to resuscitate the project. Well, I was able to document that the construction was moving along apace, and they had 40% of the units were under contract. Johnson got involved, sent a letter, and in fact, we should know by the end of this week whether Westchester is going to be able to count those units. In November, I was in Buchanan, where there's a project for 55 affordable units. There, the village there is against senior housing because they're saying that it's going to overwhelm the police department there and the ambulance service. And heaven forbid you would advertise in 9 counties for people. And again, the housing monitor sent a letter. There was a meeting that was held regarding Buchanan's resistance, and we're still waiting to see how that pans out. Yeah. Okay. All right.
What we ought to do, and again,
Fine.
is articulating how we spot through numerous things
Yes.
and continue. And what we're going to do, if I could, and I apologize,
Sure. That's fine.
and I'd like to thank David
We have 15 minutes.
So where do we go from here?
That's the question. What are the things that we need to do? Number one, how do we feel about, how can we get the consent decree enforced? I mean, that's an important, I think that's a very
Okay,
important
let's go
issue. Ahead.
quickly. The consent decree, what do you think?
Craig mentioned that the housing monitor serves at the pleasure of HUD. How can we put pressure on HUD to, based on this monitor's performance, replace them?
Greg, any thoughts?
Real quick, Greg.
These are going to have to go, these will go quickly. People have been sitting for a very long time. But the first thing not to do is to fantasize about things. It feels good to feel there's impact. Nobody on the planet wanted this consent decree to work out more than I did. But I'm not going to pretend, and I'm not going to pretend that a few units are here. HUD, unfortunately, is scared of its shadow. So there are a lot of ways, whether people gather in front of the courthouse or, but all of these three, HUD, the monitor, and the U.S. Attorney, and maybe just to deal with one other thing. Carolyn Stevens mentioned a very good question earlier, and it's a perfect example. Why is it that in Westchester, developers aren't coming? Because of all of the damn roadblocks. So what would have been the easiest thing to do if there were an implementation plan? If there were any serious implementation, that plan would have required Westchester to speak to for-profit and not-for-profit affordable housing developers elsewhere in the region and country and say, what do we need to do to make it feasible for you to build mixed quality, mixed income housing?
Okay, so we're gonna, because we want to
Never
ask
done.
you, so we're gonna talk
So
about.
what do we
Never
need to do now? So
For
what,
developers, we gotta pull them in, and what
pull
to
in
make their
developers.
life easier to
Okay.
do this.
Any other ideas?
Other
Go
ideas,
ahead.
because this is why we're here.
I speak from a political perspective. I think we need to put pressure on our elected officials through the political process. I want to take a minute. 2 of my friends here and I stayed till 1 o'clock in the morning on the night that the county finally voted the bond for this settlement. And on that night, the Board of Legislators passed a special act in which they insisted that they be part of the process of the implementation of this consent decree. The Board of Legislators has been busy blaming Astorino, but they haven't done a damn thing themselves.
So it's not, it's all.
There's an election coming up a year from this year, and every one of these Board of Legislators is up. Every one of them, Democrat and Republican, needs to be held accountable for what he or she has done. Our Congresswoman has failed, despite repeated lobbying from us, to bring pressure to bear on HUD to do something about getting this consent decree going into the court, asking Judge Coates. She's refused. Oh, I can't do that. I said to her, you mean no congressperson has ever asked HUD to do anything? No, it would be improper, says she. She's in the pocket of her Wall Street backers and her Harrison neighbors who don't want this. We have to put this pressure to bear in the electoral process.
So what steps? So number one, go into the political process. So basically, all right, yes, Catherine Borgia is a legislator, Democratic legislator.
Not a legislator on the, when the town supervisor of the town of Austin, which actually is one of the reasons we were kind of surprised about, because Austin actually is very demographically diverse. However, I have something to say about the political process, and that is, I think things like this are very, very, very useful. But one of the things that I think happens after a meeting like this is that when we, in the political realm, we fight with the administration every single day. Yes, we do blame him. We fight with the administration every single day to get information, to become part of the process. We're shut down at every opportunity. I am the Democratic Majority Leader. My predecessor, Pete Harcum, was here for a little while. When we ask for help in elections to help defeat people who are very proud to state that they don't want any federal oversight in Westchester County, that they don't believe that anyone who can't afford to live here it should be facilitated in any way to move into our communities. Nobody comes out to vote. Nobody comes out to vote. We had an election in 2015. We had 18% of people coming out to vote. So I hear a lot of outrage and a lot of finger pointing. Voter registration, people getting engaged in the process right now. When we have messaging meetings, when we have stakeholder meetings, get involved right now. Political pressure doesn't work if nobody comes out to vote. That's how representatives got reelected in places like Eastchester. That's how we lost a seat in Bedford, because people did not come out to vote. And I'm sorry, we can't. It's great to say you should be more effective. If you got a magic wand when you were elected, a lot of these problems would be solved, but we don't.
Just to respond to that for a minute, with respect, voters can't be expected to make decisions if one side is saying, you're destroying our community with what you're planning to do, and the extent of Democratic opposition is to say, don't worry, we're not saying this, nothing is going to happen.
Well,
and that's been,
because I have been told that I am shrill in the media talking about this issue.
So let's go to action steps. We're here to keep moving ahead. Yes.
How about trying to get them to direct more of the funding towards the communities that are actually doing something? I mean, so there was discussion of a new project in White Plains. White Plains is diverse, big, and the schools are diverse. I mean, every elementary school classroom in White Plains reflects the entire community.
So, I don't think that's what the
yeah, well, I mean,
what about improving the schools in the districts that are diverse, and insisting on that as a means of promoting the communities that are doing the things that are
It's not a
back to
zero sum,
Westchester.
but that strategy has been a strategy to say, people in integrated communities are only interested in living in those communities, and we're going to leave those 25 towns and villages lily white. So reinvestment in communities, that's a wonderful thing. But there has never been any kind of balance because of the resistance that has happened in all of the towns and
Let's
villages.
go to action.
You're not getting any response.
Here's the
Why not
problem.
at least
We have to give up
offer
this room.
benefits?
We have to, so here's my question. Have you all provided email addresses or whatever? Have you all provided, okay. Have you provided your email? Okay. Please email me. You can go on the Workforce Housing Coalition, that's the website.
We also invite people
Email
to
us.
pick up a hammer with us from your congregation and get involved in
Can I share something with you before you
I'm here. Yeah. And I'm here.
I think that, by the way, Chappaqua is kept. You have to organize. You use the word organize, and you have to communicate so that people become aware. And you have to do this consistently. And there's got to be a person that is going to bring awareness. And that will bring political pressure. Politicians, they don't really like a lot of information that a lot of people have. That you have to organize. There is nothing about